Yeah, okay.
Oh. No, I cannot share it. So my research studies the music of Malik Mezzadri, Nelson Veras, and Bo van der Werf music, and their use of formal system for composition and improvisation. All three began their musical career at the end of the 90s, a time when jazz and arts in general became predominantly postmodernist. 30 years before, in the 60s, the free jazz and modal jazz movement have somewhat shaken the rules of what we now call common jazz practice. During the following years, a part of the jazz scene will question the function of their practice, the links with tradition, but also the act of improvisation itself. If we extend the extemporization further and further, what is left? Originally, musicians took melodies and varied them through improvisation to the point where this improvised melody could be extracted from their point of origin. Only the framework of the original melody is kept, i.e. the harmonic framework, and a new discourse is created on top of it. A degree of abstraction concerning the identity of the piece is encroached. If one pushes a little further, like the second quintet of Miles Davis at the end of the 60s, it's possible to move a little further away from the original framework and take the musical discourse out of its initial environment while keeping the latter as a reference. The different initiatives during the history of jazz are also correlated with the evolution of a formalization of jazz, with pedagogical vocation, notably the chord scale theory, which will create abstract conception of the act of improvisation within a given practice. Abstraction is a way to assimilate a complex reality and thus a way to transmit it easily. Jazz, with its nevertheless a phonographic regime, also has this other facet of abstraction. Thus, of all complexity transmitted by the recording does not infringe on the abstraction to formal vocation, but on the contrary, directs it. There are certain notions specific to audio-tactile music are preserved: groove, the isochronous pulse, embodiment, formativity, etc. But we change the elements and the object from which we build this complex reality. The goal is to retain the cognitive and aesthetics attributes of audio-tactile music while breaking through the limitation of the experience alone. Laurent is still not there. So formalization, as I said before, the objective of formalization is to assimilate more easily a complex reality through abstraction. I choose the starry sky as an example of a complex reality that has been formalized through constellation. I don't know if some of you. Ah.
Oui.
On a besoin de toi pour démarrer le partage.
On a besoin de ton autorisation pour
Je viens de libérer le partage d'écran.
Oui, exactement, c'est ça.
Désolé pour ce contretemps, je pensais que ça marcherait sans moi, mais c'est pas le cas apparemment. Le monde a besoin de moi, c'est terrible. Est-ce que tu as lancé l'enregistrement?
Oui, ça, en fait, là, c'est parti.
Bon, on coupera les 10 premières minutes. Bon, désolé pour ce contretemps.
Ok. Donc, oui. I don't know if you see the right screen.
Like we see assimilate a complex reality.
Yeah, that is. So I don't know if some of you have already done astronomy, but learning the constellation is the first step to be able to find your way around the sky. The process that allows the development of the constellation system when first the process that allows the development of the constellation system went first through an abstraction, that of considering the complex star of nuclear fusion reaction to a simple entity that we name star. Once this abstraction by simplification is done, we obtain a set of discrete objects for which we have given a name like Altair, Sirius, or Vega. This act of naming is important in the formalization process because we give an identity to an object which allows us to call upon it in a recurrent manner. The next step is to gather these objects into sets which will also be named in order to assimilate more easily the large number of initial elements. These are the constellations. Now it's easier for us to find our way in the sky, and by extension inside, in order to observe or search for new elements. When you are an amateur astronomer, once you know the constellations that are visible to naked eye, you must point your telescope at specific locations relative to these sets to find distant objects. It's now possible to communicate more easily about the starry sky and to understand more precisely different existing relationships. Thanks to formalization, we have gone beyond the simple sensitive experience of observing point of light in the sky to the creation of a whole with its own. With this example, I illustrated different stages of formalization. However, the starry sky is a perception of fixed objects, and its formalization amounts to a classification. A classification takes a set of objects and seeks by abstraction to link some of them to form one of the more palpable units. To come back to jazz, it includes many abstractions resulting from the condition of its practice. Let's take, for example, the symbolic notation of chords used almost systematically in jazz. One of the first abstractions is that of the real pitch of the note, which is reduced to the abstraction of the octave. In other words, a melodic theme can be played in any octave or have octave changes within its statement without losing its function. The same is true for the notes involved in a chord symbol. What is generally called voicing is not defined. A chord symbol represents only a set of notes. However, this use of chord symbol also calls for certain practice of music that could be called functional. As some studies in neuroscience, such as those I mentioned here, have shown, this conception of music by functions modifies the perception of music. Jazz musicians tend to perceive chords by abstract function, whereas musicians of the classical tradition differentiate arrangement of the same set of notes. In reality, a chord symbol in jazz practice implies much more information than just a set of notes. For example, it can indicate a specific mode, a specific function, or a way of understanding that set of notes. The function of chord itself have aspects of abstraction in jazz practice with many possible substitutions that create an harmonic conception that could be called extemporized. All these considerations are beyond the scope of my presentation today, but they show the importance of abstraction and a certain formalization in the practice of jazz that will lead to musical scene that I study more specifically. So far, I have only talked about abstraction and formalization, which generally allow to apprehend a complex reality. Formal system introduce the idea of deductibility. First of all, I would like to clarify the difference of the notion of formal, which can have another meaning in musical theories and in musicology. I'm not talking here about the temporal arrangements of semantic elements of the music as the sonata form can be. Here, the idea of formal can be conceived as the conception of manipulation of objects without particular meaning, which are only defined by relation to other objects. By extension, a formal system is a set of objects, a set of development rules, which are axioms, that will build a whole according to a notion of deductibility. By axiom, I mean that these fundamental objects are and rules do not need to be defined according to a principle of deductibility. They are the starting postulates that allow to build the system. Euclidean geometry is a well-known example of formal system with its 5 axioms. Initially, a formal system is always closed on itself. In other words, it only takes into consideration what is defined within it. A concrete example is computer programming languages. In reality, formal systems are more or less permeable to a natural context. If we take the example of computer programming languages, depending on their level in relation to the binary language of the machine, they call more or less on extra system notion that allow men to communicate more easily with the machine. We can see the formal system as a way to extend a natural language by means of abstraction. Let's go back to the musicians whose name I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation, and more particularly Malik Mezzadri. Before showing you an example of formal system created and used by this musician, I give you some biographical information. Malik Mezzadri was born in 1969 in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, but grew up in Guadeloupe. After having started with the recorder and then the traverse flute, he joined the Metropolis to obtain his prize at the Marseille Conservatory in 1986 or 7, and then moved to Paris when he joined the reggae group Human Spirits, with whom he stayed for more than 10 years. At the end of the 90s, he met French saxophonist Julien Leroux and joined his band to tour in Latin America and Africa in 2000. On his return, he records the disc 6996, which contains the first sketches of formal logic within his composition. A year later, he met the American saxophonist Steve Coleman during a festival organized by their common label, Label Bleu. In 2002, he records the album 237 XP1, which includes a disc entirely dedicated to composition called XP, which means experience, on which Steve Coleman is present. I've chosen the XP1 composition as an example of the use of formal system in contemporary jazz practice, which I will discuss in detail next. For the disc 13 XP Songs book, he will deepen the harmonic work of the objects that he conceptualized, called tonal signature, that he applies to French popular melodies. Malik Mezzadri will continue the exploration of his system in the following disc, XP2, published in 2004. He will confront his formal conception with the modes with limited transposition during his collaboration with the Belgian saxophonist Bo van der Werf. I skipped the various release of record because the flautist starts researching other formal systems around 2008. I just specified that in 2010, he obtained a one-year residency at the Villa Médicis with Gilbert Nuno and Claire Diterzi. And in 2015, he was awarded the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres. Let's move on to two conceptions, one harmonic and the other rhythmic, which forms the basis of the piece written under the title XP. Tonal signature. In his musical research, Malik Mezzadri seeks to minimize information. Therefore, he will try to find a way to synthesize the tonal space in the smallest possible set of notes. First of all, he defines the tonal space as a 12th transposition of the major, melodic minor, and harmonic minor modes. This space can be represented as in a matrix where the x-axis contains the 12 notes of the equal temperament, represented in numerical form where 0 symbolizes C, etc. And the y-axis correspond to the 36 scales obtained by transposition. So there is the tonal space matrix. It's just a way to have all the scale in the same view. I don't know if it's clear, but here we can see that in C scale, C major scale, we have C, D, E, F, G. And we got the 12th transposition for major modes, melodic minor, that is represented by a little m, and harmonic minor modes. The goal of the flutist is to find the smallest set that belongs to one and only one of the 36 possible scale. To do this, it performs a logical operation between the range for which he wants to find the desired set and all the other range in succession. He takes a scale and compare it to all the other scales. This logical operation is called non-implication or abduction, the truth table of which is as follows. So if P represents a note from the third scale that we want to find the tonal signature, and Q means a note in the comparative scale. If we look to the next table, I just applied this logical gate. Like if we look at it in detail, the only truth answer is when a note is contained in the first scale, but not contained in the comparative scale. All the other case is false. So if the note is contained in the two scale, we do not keep it. And if it's not in the first scale, we don't keep it too. If I apply this to all the scale from the C major scale, we can see that if I take big M and 5, that means the F major scale. We can see that the only note that is contained in C major scale that is not contained in F major scale is B, because in F major scale, B is B flat. If I take another one like little M0, so C melodic minor, we can see that the only note that is contained in C major and not contained in C melodic minor is the fourth note, is E, E natural, because E is E flat in C melodic minor. So after, if we sum all the notes that are not contained in the comparative scale, Malik Mezzadri just keeps the notes that differentiate the initial scale from the most common note scales, like F major or G major. And here in the last column, I've notated the notes that differentiate C major scale from the most common note scale. And we've got 5 pitch: B, F, E, C, and G. If we keep only the notes that differentiate the initial scale from the scale with the most common notes, we obtain a set of notes that exist only in our initial scale. For each scale, I note on the right the sum of the common note, and when the result was the smallest possible, here is the value of 1. I note which note was represented by this value of 1. When we gather the selected notes, we obtain for C major the notes C, E, F, G, B. Malik Mezzadri will name this set the tonal signature of C major, which he notes big M, big C. He applies the same process to the other 2 scale types to find the tonal signature for the harmonic minor mode and the melodic minor mode. Initially, he finds 5 sets. One of 5 notes for the major tonal signature. They are noted by a big M followed by the notes indicating the transposition. So here it's tonal signature for C major. One of 4 notes of the melodic minor tonal signature noted by the little m, and 3 or 4 notes for the harmonic minor signature noted by the letter H. Later, when he collaborated with the mathematician Frédéric Faure to verify these results, he added 2 tonal signatures of 5 notes for the melodic minor modes. I frame them here. We can hear all the tonal signature here. I don't know if I've got sound. No.
No. Maybe you have to stop.
Il faut redémarrer le partage.
And do it again. Il faut cocher le partage de son au moment du partage d'écran.
Oui, exactement.
Je partager l'audio. On entend quelque chose? Ouais.
Ah oui.
Yep, oui, bon.
Okay, switch back to English. When listening to these chords, here all transposed to C, one notices that the nature of the chord is rather difficult to perceive. It's a surprising ambivalence. Whereas the initial formal constraint gives us a condensation of tonal information, in other words, a precise definition of location in tonal space, we get very indefinite objects at the sensitive level. However, triads can be found within the generated sets, but the presence of added notes blurs their perception. Formerly, Malik Mezzadri takes as his starting point the 12 pitches of the equal temperament system, as well as the 3 major and minor scale. Note that the idea of formalizing this 3 nature of mode is already an abstraction reminiscent of chord scale theory. For example, the ascending melodic minor mode is considered as a separate entity. The initial context that is at the basis of the creation of this mode is completely ignored, as it's generally the case in jazz practice. Respectively to what I explained before, we observe a process of naming sets that give a new importance to these sets. On these subjects, I would like to point out that the symbolic notation of the chord differs somewhat from what we are used in the common jazz practice. For example, the sets of M3C and H3C do not contain the note C. The detail has its importance in the visual aspects present in this practice. I'm not going to detail now the different rules of organization sought by Malik Mezzadri, but I would like to explain you another concept of organization which is present at the base of XP pieces, the concept of thalea color. Traditionally, we tend to conceive the elementary unit of music by the notion of a note, which include a pitch and a duration. In the case of thalea color, The idea is to separate these two attributes and create series of pitch, called color, and series of durations, called thalea. Malik Mezzadri pushes the abstraction of rhythmic value a little further, minimizing them to a relative binary values, long and short. I've just put an example here from a melody I've just write, where the color is just the pitch, and we can translate the durations to number or just long, 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 short, short, long. Long values are symbolized by a line, and the short value by a dot. The relationship between the two values is written in generic form. By default, when nothing is written, it's 1 to 2. The flautist will use this tonal signature to generate sequences of note pitches and will assign a series of rhythmic values to them. The interest is that the series of pitches and the series of durations do not have the same cardinality, in order to create a phase shift. If I schematize this notion, we can symbolize a series of 3 pitch by the letter ABC and a series of 2 duration by the number 1 and 2. When we combine them together, we obtain the following sequence. This combinatorial process creates a shift in rhythmic and melodic accent, resulting in musical sensation that is constantly varied but with a great amount of similarity. We will see it just after when I will show you a score of the XP1 piece, but the combination of the two sequences must be done by the musician during the performance. Malik Mezzadri does not provide the results of the combinatory in a written way. This implies a certain connective disposition. Moreover, this other informalization of time modifies the usual conception of measurement. Indeed, the concept of measure represents certain gravity coming from the precise location of rhythmic and melodic harmonic accent. We can still represent the music played in a metric, which is the sum of the duration value of the thalea, but the meaning of the measure is no longer really present in this music, or at least in a different way. I could go on and on, but all the considerations that this imply aesthetically and connectively, but I leave that for the discussion. Let's look at an example of a recording of the very first composition under the name XP. It is probably named XP1, and as the signature score attests, was written April 16, 2002, on the first day of the recording of the 237 XP1 disc, and almost 20 years ago on the dot. We can see that the score is organized in 4 parts: one for the bass, here, up there, one for the keyboard, one for the drums, and one last one for the improvising soloist. There are different tonal signatures noted for each part. I briefly explain how the drum parts are written. Another abstraction made by Malik Mezzadri is that the drums are reduced to 2 sounds, a high and a low tone, each of which is symbolized by a dot on 2 lines. The color of the drum are then a succession of high and low sounds representing the bass drum and the snare drum. So for the first color for the drums is bass drum, snare, bass drum, and snare, bass drum, snare. I will now show you an animation of the transcription I made of the recording made for this composition. In addition to the conventional transcription of the instruments, I highlighted the flow of different cycles. Before launching the video, I reiterate that this recording is made on the same day of the composition, what you will hear now is the result of the musician applying the notion I mentioned without having the time to work on them before the recording.
Paul,
Ouais.
excuse-moi. En fait, on a perdu un côté de l'audio quand tu parles. Je ne sais pas si c'est un faux contact ou...
Mais je me demande si dans la musique, ça marche pas, par contre. Là,
Et dans la musique, ça marche, mais pas avec le
Ouais.
micro.
Bon, c'est pas très grave quand même. Ouais.
Ok.
Enfin, si la musique, on peut l'entendre en stéréo, ça suffit peut-être, non?
Je vérifie juste à quoi c'est dû. Non, normalement c'est bon. Mais... Bon, je joue la vidéo. In the 60s, jazz took several directions, notably that of deconstruction in the quest for greater freedom. This reconsideration of the practice will be followed by a questioning of the improvised musical discourse, its function and its meaning, where Miles Davis and his second quintet sought to reduce the music they play to a certain essence, leading notably to the notion of rhythm no changes. Another direction has been taken by other musicians. Contrary to appearance, abstraction is at the heart of jazz practice without being the end of it. Far from the computer dreams of Frank Zappa in the music of Jazz from Hell, the formal system presented here are in no way a finality. On the contrary, they highlight all the parameters of the audio-tactile music that are not taken into account by the system itself. During the numerous interviews with the three musicians of my research corpus, I was reminded many times of the importance of rhythmic placement, phrasing, and articulation and sound. Formal systems only serve to put improvising musicians in unconventional cognitive disposition and constrain playing habits derived from cultural practices. This uses of formal system also raised many aesthetic questions about jazz practice. Nelson Veras indicated that he used system in his music making to be ahead of his taste. The reliance of formal logic to make aesthetic choice questions the possible aesthetic meaning of the practice of jazz and, by extension, of audio-tactile music. It is often said that in jazz, it's not what you play, but how you play it that counts. In spite of appearance, my research seems to agree with this statement. On the other hand, the practice of formal system within audio-tactile music provide additional implicit meaning to objects that have little or no cultural meaning. On the one hand, when we listen to this musician, who negotiate with all the constraints to express a musical discourse. In real time, we hear a whole connective and bodily system that speaks to us. theoretically, formal systems have a very large number of possibilities, but the fact of confronting them in real time reduces these possibilities. Therefore, the choice made, not for aesthetic reasons, but for practical reasons, put forward certain assets of audio-tactile music. I will stop here for tonight and thank you for the listening.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. And then we can start with the Q&A. I can see already some questions. So one from Laurent. I saw a hand, and also Leo maybe had a question. Yeah, he raised his hand. So Daniel also. So okay, let's start with Leo maybe. What's the first one?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Paul. It was a really fascinating presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I've gathered a bit of information along the way about your research project, but it's great to see it in more detail right here. One thing I was interested that you perhaps could elaborate on is you mentioned that it was written on the day of the recording session. Obviously, these structures that Magic Malik is using, he'd been integrating for a while in his professional practice privately. And what I find really interesting about that is it really echoes the famous story about giant steps, with John Coltrane having practiced the very unusual chord progression that really hadn't been, I mean, we know it finds its place in the bridge of Have You Met Miss Jones, but not to the same extent. So this difficult chord progression that no one else could handle, John Coltrane had been practicing it for like 13 hours a day. And suddenly he expects his musicians, notably Tommy Flanagan, to play this same piece with no preparation. And do you think that's a compositional choice on the part of Magic Malik to sort of put his musicians in such a sort of a cruel situation?
I don't know it's about to be cruel with his musician, but in the first album...
Excuse-moi, Paul, mais on a vraiment un problème pour t'entendre, là. Ah. Non seulement il n'y a qu'un canal, mais c'est très faible en plus. Alors qu'au début, avant que tu passes la musique, ça fonctionnait.
Je ne sais pas si c'est mieux, là, si on m'entend mieux ou pas du tout.
Oui, un petit peu. Bon, excuse-moi, continue alors.
Est-ce que là, c'est mieux?
Un peu, oui.
Bon.
Vas-y, tu peux y aller.
Leo. And I don't know if it's apart to be cruel, but for this recording session, he wrote a lot of composition like a normal way, with not using his system, but just a little bit. He used Alea Color, but written everything for the musician. And this piece, this way of thinking and where the XP come from, is because he has done a recording session with Steve Coleman just a month before, and Steve Coleman used the hexagram and diagram from Yeking, and he takes the same idea and try it just like to train before the real recording, but they record it and put on the disc, and after he worked on them deeper and deeper. But one aspect of this formal system that Malik's Mezzadri wants is that everyone could play on the XP's composition without knowing what happened. Just he tried to find another way to organize polycycle music, because he played before with a Belgian group Akamoon, where or with Stéphane Payen, where the cycle have to be rigid and just find the same one at X time. And Malik wants to have something more organic, or that even in this transcription, the drummer makes some mistakes, but you can follow and continue to play music without, even if there is some mistakes. So it's not that cruel, I think.
But the point is, he was practicing this stuff before he, whereas his musicians were not.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point. I mean,
Yes, but I think he chooses the musician that he knows that they can play this kind of thing, even if they haven't rehearsed it before. So, and as Paul said, there is a possibility that the mistake could be made. That's not so rigid. So I agree, that's not so cruel.
I still think Tommy Flanagan, he said that he really didn't appreciate John Coltrane dumping that piece on him on the day of the session.
Yes.
Well, actually, Leo, you know that he got the music before, but he thought
it was
a ballad.
slow. Yeah.
So he practiced it very slowly.
Yes. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, so next one is Daniel. You can mute yourself.
Yeah. Everybody hears me?
Yeah.
Yes. Thanks for the very interesting talk and material. I have a bit of a question about the way you present it within a certain theoretical framework. I would like to ask you, is it really a matter of mere abstraction? I think I don't know Magic Malik so good, but there's another reason to now listen more to his stuff. I just noticed because it's terrific. But isn't this something, Coltrane has been mentioned, I think of Dolphy or Dave Liebman, that is always happening in jazz, like finding through certain procedures and ways of developing your material to a unique language somehow. But shouldn't we say it's not merely a matter of abstraction, because it sounds we have a full richness and then we carve out stuff, but shouldn't we rather say it's a matter of formation or bringing about or producing the material to play? What would you say about that? To tell a bit another story, not the one to say we have a rich environment, we cut stuff out, but rather to say we develop new materials through certain procedures. And this is something I think is not so uncommon for jazz practice per se.
It's a bit of both, because if we want to just take piece and create something new, it can take another postulate or action, like not taking the tonal system and taking something else. When I choose to use the concept of abstraction is because when I talk with Malik, he always thinking the music about just the formal aspects of music, and I don't know to answer the question, because I think it's almost the same thing. The difference here is because every aspect of the music is abstract and reconstruct, but for not every, but the pitch and rhythm. The other one is let on the formativity aspect. But the I don't know to answer to the question, because for Eric Dolphy and Dave Liebman is quite from a more free way to do it. It's not as strict as constrained. Here we've got a really formal way, an abstract way of thinking of music. When Dave Liebman he said about his way of thinking to 251 over another tonality or something like that. It just take some conceptions that already exist in jazz playing, like side slipping or something like that, and it do not formalize them and abstract them from their environment. It just extends these environments, but it's not like Malik that he go back to the very beginning of the way of thinking music, of thinking the rhythm, thinking the way to organize time and the way to organize chords between every musicians. So I don't know if I answer well, but Eric Dolphy is the same. He takes blues and it's really for me it's like Ornette Coleman and free jazz. They break the rule through it, not by ignore the rules.
Thank you, Paul. So next one is Laila. We have 5 minutes maybe for the Q&A.
Yeah, it's going to be short. Thank you very much, Paul. It was wonderful. And I'm sure you had a lot more to say. But it was nice to have a little bit of your research. I have a question because I actually played with Malik in 2005 and I invited him in my band to perform my music. And I remember that he was improvising on a few solos that were quite modal. And at that time, he told me a few things, like probably it was the system you were talking about. But I didn't really remember all the things he told me. And he wrote some things, you know, on the charts. Like, I'm sure it was something close to what you told before on comparing different modes and keeping the main elements that were different between modes. But I would like you, if it's possible, to take a few minutes to explain again that part, because I did not get it. I got, you know, the tables where you compare modes, and I understood the numbers on the right. There were 2 columns, but I did not get the passage between this and then the 4 or 5 notes typical from melodic or harmonic or something.
I will share my screen again just to show you for each scale, he choose the different notes. It's not a different the initial scale from all the others, and it just keep
The common.
the not the common notes,
The
notes
uncommon.
that are only contained in C major, but not
Yeah.
contained in the scales that have the most common note. Because if you can differentiate your initial scale from the most common one, you can different your scale from the other one, because the other one are
Yes.
more different.
Yeah, I got that. Thank you.
So just with 5 notes, there is no other scale with do, re, mi, fa, sol, si, except C major. And each time he chooses the way to differentiate
Yes.
the initial scale from the most common one.
Yes, but what's the point to going to the next you know, table where he says, for example, okay, for C major I'm going to play C, E, F, A, B,
GB.
GB. Yeah, how do you get to that?
How to get to the 5 notes?
Yeah,
Because
from the table.
the table when you I will show it again. Here you can see that for the number tone, the ton voisin in French, there is the most common tone because there is just one alteration. So if we keep the note that is alterated in this scale, you can differentiate with, for example, B, the note B. You differentiate C major from F major and from all the other notes that have B flat, all modes.
Okay.
For G major, we keep the F instead of F sharp.
Yeah.
So we can differentiate C major from all the scales that have F sharp. So like in the circle of fifths, if we just put these two notes, all the other are going to contain those notes, because you know the circle of fifths. Like if you go to the sharp side, after G, D got the F sharp.
Yeah.
So if we on each side of the circle of fifths, we take the first alteration and we keep the notes that are not alterated, we can differentiate them. So if we're just looking at the major mode parts of the table here, we just see the two notes, the F and the B natural. And after, it takes the same thing for the melodic minor, and there is just two notes too here. It's the E natural and D, and C, sorry.
Okay.
And after there is some, you can reiterate for major tonal signature. You have to just do one step because you have a lot of scales that have just one note to differentiate, so it's okay. But for minor melodic minor, you have to reiterate these steps and choose always the notes that have the scales that have the most common note, and just one note differentiates the initial scale from the comparative scales. I don't know if it's more clear.
Maybe. Actually, is there a link between these tables and the typical
put the next one up on the next screen as well.
Actually,
Paul,
it's the one after that was really interesting. Sorry, maybe it's too late to. We can.
You say the first one, this one with
no, after.
the notes?
No, we understand. We understand that, you know, the B and the
yes,
F.
this is the one.
Yeah.
And what is the question here?
So, is there a link, a logical link between this and the one before?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because here it's just this table. It's just to find the one, this one, the first one, the major tonal signature from major modes.
Yeah.
So he applies this for, because when you find for C major, you have just to transpose the set of notes to another scale, and you have the tonal signature of the transposed scale. So if we just do it for C major, we have these 5 notes here, because each time I have one here, because in C sharp or G flat, there is a lot of notes that are contained in C and not contained in C sharp.
Yes, I got it.
We want to differentiate from the most common one, because if I play there is too much notes in C major that differentiate from C sharp, in C major from C sharp. So we want to differentiate from the most common one, because by extension we will differentiate the set from the other, because they are more different.
Maybe we can do a special session on that, because I'm working for 3 years with Paul, and
Thank you
quite
very
not
much.
sure to have explained, to have understood the whole thing.
See, for me, sorry, I just got to say, I can talk to you about it later, but C should not be in the tonal signature of all of them if it's, because it's not unique just to C major. It plays, so there's a little problem there. Like for me, the tonal signature of C major is 2 notes, according to that system you just.
Please, Leo, we have another guest.
But we will.
Yeah, maybe we can discuss this later on.
Yes.
Daniel has to leave at 7 p.m., so we have to be strict with the timing. So I'm very glad to present Daniel Martin Feige, who is professor of philosophy and aesthetics at Stuttgart State Academy of Art and Design. He is also a jazz musician. He studied jazz piano and is a philosopher, of course. And he has 2 books he wrote on music, one on the philosophy of jazz, and the other one is an introduction to music aesthetics. And he's also working on broader topics in philosophy and aesthetics. But today he's gonna present a talk titled The Aesthetic Temporality of Musical Improvisation in the Case of Jazz Improvisation, with some remarks on the relation of improvisation and interpretation. So Daniel, if you have a PowerPoint, or you can share your screen. Maybe you need, okay, no, it works, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will now start. So it's working. Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation, Lisa, also Laurent and Pia. Great to be here with you. And I'm very sorry that probably everybody has to speak English because of me, because I'm just not able to understand French in Italy. This being said, my wife did a coup d'etat in Paris. It's really a shame. So I'm the language idiot in our family. I'm very sorry that I can only give the talk in English. I hope it's anyway understandable. And I have to say, after Paul's terrific talk, I'm zooming a lot out. So it's about the big philosophical questions connected to topics in philosophy jazz. Maybe I got 1 or 2 points where I can point at your talk, Paul. I'm not sure yet if I can do that. And I also have a script. It's not a free improvisation that will lead me through some of the ideas I will trying to develop, and I will be talking about 30 minutes. So the following statement has often been attributed to Miles Davis, and I think quite sure he never said that, but it's a good mind catcher anyway, because there's something paradoxically interesting about this statement. Do not fear mistakes, there are none. On first sight, it seems to be plainly wrong. Anyone who has ever picked up an instrument will know only too well that there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And also jazz listeners among you will know that improvising is not something you can do like that. Even talented musicians have to practice hard so that their talent can unfold. It is, the story is, everybody knows that Coltrane and Brecker, for example, played for hours and hours, even if they were already world stars and developed new stuff. Rather, it is to be understood as saying that the category of error in jazz is problematic precisely because or when this music is understood as essentially improvised. And my colleague and friend Alessandro Bertinetto wrote a terrific paper about the category of error. There are some, I draw on some of his ideas here also. This can be explained as follows. The aesthetic temporality of jazz is one that knows no pre-given rules of success. Rather, successful jazz improvisations bring forth the criteria of what it means to succeed in and through the performance itself. Am I okay from the tempo? Is it too fast or okay?
Great.
Give me a sign. Sometimes I talk too fast, so stop me. My aim in what follows will be to develop this idea of a specific aesthetic temporality of jazz improvisation, as well as to ask how the relationship of musical improvisation in jazz to musical interpretations in the tradition of European art music can be understood. To this end, I will proceed in 2 steps. The first step, I will say something about the aesthetic temporality of jazz improvisation, and then I will briefly say something about interpretations and the relations to improvisation. And that's a bit of fake news because the first part is the main part of the talk. The second is rather a short remark. afterwards. And I start a bit more in detail, and then I zoom even more wider out from the whole picture. Why can't this initially mentioned sentence be understood as saying that everything one does in an improvisation is equally good, so that jazz improvisation would be something like the subcategory of the, at the moment, much discussed aesthetics of the dilettantism or something like this? This is so for the following reasons. Improvisation, at least in jazz, can succeed or fail. They can be aesthetically sparkling or less sparkling, which is true even for improvisations of free jazz and those of Malik too, I suppose, which may seem for untrained listeners rather strange. In jazz, however, unlike in the tradition of European art music, the fact that they succeed or fail, are powerful or not, cannot be explained by recourse to musical works on which the improvisation is based. To not let this surprise listeners from the context of the tradition of European art music, a few remarks on the role of the work in this tradition seems helpful to me. Of course, one can speak of a work in at least two ways. On the one hand, it can mean non-specifically the product of aesthetic labor, and thus that which is the primary object of aesthetic appreciation in the case in question. If this term is applied, compositions as well as improvisations, tracks, as well as musical interpretations are equally works. On the other hand, the concept of the musical work can also be understood terminologically in such a way that it means the product of composing, which at the same time exists in such a way that it is made to be articulated in and through musical interpretations, which is more or less means the correspondence to something like the spirit of the work. I will say a bit more about that. It is the second sense that I have in mind at this point. This concept of the work is a relatively recent invention. It exists as an independent mode of existence of music only since about the time of Beethoven, probably. The tradition before Beethoven had not yet been able to understand the activity of composing in such a way as to produce musical works in the modern sense. And Baroque composers did not necessarily see it as an encroachment in the artistic authority when third parties rewrote their musical texts and continued to work on them. Today, when we praise the power of Bach's musical works, we look at them from a perspective of a musical practice that certainly represents a certain kind of break from its time. The musical work is the product of the activity of the composer or several composers, is manifested in a score and is made to be articulated in and through musical interpretations. To put it really simply, by playing the score. I won't go into more detail at this point concerning the mode of being of a musical work. I would say some brief things at the end. Rather, I want to note that despite the apparent implosion of the category of musical work in, say, contemporary classical music, it has often been mistakenly assumed that the work is simply abandoned here. What rather happens, at least in large parts, is not a farewell to the work, but an unfolding of its immanent dialectic, as well as a complexification of its mode of being. In the course of the early differentiated composing in new music, the material is not only developed according to parameters that can only be inadequately described by terms such as melody, harmony, and rhythm. Rather, dimensions that were formerly external to the musical work or to musical works, such as dimensions of the performance, the technical medial conditions, and so on, have recently been fed into the logic of the work itself. There is nothing to prevent us from continuing to understand many of those practices as being centered about certain kinds of musical works. In short, even if the category of musical work by no means determines the totality of musical practices in the tradition of European art music, it is nevertheless not the case that it should be hastily put aside or condemned with regard to understanding the contemporary developments in this music. This could be a talk on its own right, but I just want to say, if we can understand these developments that somehow attack the classical notion of the work as still being part of a dialectical story to tell about the development of what it means to be a work. How about musical works in jazz? To start with the restriction of what I will be developing in a minute, of course, in some practices of jazz, there are also something like musical works. This is not only true for musicians of the third stream, which somehow border between jazz and new music, but also for past and recent big band compositions. It should be noted, however, that in many cases of classical big band music, and I'm thinking here especially of Duke Ellington, the idea of faithfulness to the work did not play a relevant role in this practice. As Andrew Kania has shown, Ellington understands notations primarily as aids to practice and often wrote and rewrote passages of the scores to suit his current band members. And likewise, it should be noted that also in those cases where we have scores in jazz, a vast majority somehow makes room for improvisation. Even if one should say, well, I would go into this direction that no one who cannot improvise is really a jazz musician. There's nothing to say against admitting the existence of musical works in jazz in some cases. Pointing out the difference between two forms of musical practice, musical interpretation of musical works, and musical improvisation, on the other hand, does not commit us to giving strict definitional criteria that clearly puts objects of the world exclusively in one category or the other. However, here I also show a sheet. Unlike in large parts of the tradition of European art music in modernity, works are not paradigmatic to jazz. This can be demonstrated even by a paradigmatic practice of jazz that on first sight seems to incorporate works. I address the practice of playing standards here. Standards are somewhat the dynamic canon of jazz. Some philosophers of music have suggested, and I mean Stephen Davis amongst others here, that standards should be understood as thin works. This seems to be supported by the fact that different jazz musicians can play the same standard. Autumn Leaves is played by Bill Evans, Chick Corea, Jackie Terrasson, etc. Talking about jazz standards as thin works interprets this fact in such a way that there is a common basis upon which those musicians build up their improvisations, and further, that it would be this basis that would entail that their musical performances are improvisations on the corresponding standard. It is obvious to understand as such a basis to the lead sheet, which, for example, can be found in real books. Just as in conventional scores in the tradition of European art music, for example, phrasing cannot be unambiguously specified, as well as there are in most cases no specific voicings spelled out. Paul also talked about that. You can play, I will actually say that you somehow can play whatever you want if it works, but you can play a 9, 11 is normally amongst some basic repertoire, playing a C minor 7. Bill Evans on Portrait in Jazz sometimes plays the altered scales over the F dominant 7 chord and so on. Nevertheless, the melody is written down here and it's said what the form basically looks like and what the chords basically are. According to this thought, one can say, if most scores in the tradition of European art music define many characteristics of a work, or to violate these conditions in playing then means to no longer play this work, or at least to make a mistake, scores in jazz define only a few characteristics of the corresponding work. To use an analogy that somehow is not completely fitting, but one can say the former would be something like fully developed drawings, the later sketches limited to just some basic features. Is the tempo still okay? Yeah?
Right.
Good. The problem, now I'm going a bit up. The problem, however, with the thesis that standards are thin works that come with corresponding thin scores is that I think it is plainly wrong. This is the case for the following reason. Unlike playing a score, when you play a jazz standard, you have not already made a mistake or stopped playing that standard question if you play something other than what is notated. So it is not the case that improvising over a jazz standard would involve only those aspects that are not clearly notated, such as which specific voicings you use, as far as the basic chord tones are there or something like that. For example, it is common practice to replace the dominant seventh chord in the classic 2-5-1 progression with a tritone substitution and other things. However, whoever begins to do something like this with a piano sonata of Beethoven certainly no longer plays the corresponding piano sonata, but uses it as material for a musical practice of a different kind. But the transgression of the supposed score goes much further in jazz. Even the functional harmonic relationships are often redefined altogether in the jointly playing of advanced musicians and often even abandoned as in model playing. This being said, one has to note that often the form of the standard somehow remains in play, so that the musicians often arrive after a collective, probably long movement, something like the tonica, but it doesn't always have to be the case. But if you play Autumn Leaves in a key other than G minor, in a tempo other than medium, if you base it on a bossa nova rhythm instead of a swing feel, if you reharmonize its harmonic structure in favor of certain progressions, or if you think about color tones, or if you use Magic Malik's way of playing over somehow the harmonies, you have not thereby stopped playing the standard. That this is possible shows that lead sheets are no scores and standards are no works. To do justice to a standard must then mean something completely different than to do justice to a work of in an interpretation, if it means anything at all. To play a standard adequately means nothing else than to get something aesthetically powerful out of it against the background of a tradition of playing this standard. And let's see that even Malik somehow integrates himself into the tradition because the basic harmonic material, major scale, harmonic minor, melodic minor, and so on, are really classical stuff. He's just doing really unique new things with and reorganize this material. But also he, of course, somehow goes into a tradition of jazz by picking up this kind of thinking. To play a standing, okay. This also has to do with the fact that lead sheets are usually not scores from the hands of composers, but transcriptions of historically particularly influential recordings of the standards, reduced to a few details. Often you can see in real books as played by so-and-so. They are, in a sense, snapshots of something that is in fact in flux. It is no wonder that advanced jazz musicians usually dispense with the notations altogether and rely primarily on their ears and habitualized bodily knowledge in the performance of improvisation. And if I'm right, this is not simply because they have memorized thin scores of thin works, but because they are engaged in a musical practice of a very different kind, that a practice related to interpretations of works. These remarks bring me to the following central question. If it is the case that improvisation cannot rely on an authoritative musical text, what then ensures and makes comprehensible the distinction between success and failure? Here I come back to the initial slogan. If something is already certain before one performs a musical interpretation of a musical work, namely, for example, what would be a wrong note at a certain point, this is not the case in jazz. What is an aesthetic mistake and what is an aesthetically appropriate and relevant move in playing is only negotiated in and through the improvisation itself. Thus, the initial phrase I put on the second slide can be understood as saying that what is and is not a mistake is not determined beforehand of the improvisation, nor before it concludes. In other words, whether something is a mistake, not only meant in the sense of a wrong note or something like that, but also in the sense of an unproductive or boring move, is negotiated in and through the improvisation that is determined in the course of the execution itself. I now have another example, a citation from, this is proven from Hancock, and then I go up to draw some higher theoretical conclusions from that. Herbie Hancock reports about a gig with Miles Davis in '67, when Shorter had taken a solo on So What. Miles was playing and building, and then I played the wrong chord. It was so wrong. In an instant, time stood still and I felt totally shattered. Miles took a breath and then he played this phrase that made my chord right. It didn't seem possible. I still don't know how he did it, but Miles hadn't heard it as a wrong chord. He took it as an unexpected chord. He didn't judge what I played. The last sentence, of course, is wrong, because making a wrong note right through one's playing is precisely a practical musical judgment. Nevertheless, the story is instructive because it shows the following. By giving meaning to the chord through his doing, Miles Davis treated the chord as a meaningful chord. Miles Davis' playing gave Hancock's playing meaning through what he himself played afterwards. From this, a crucial insight can be gained regarding what I would call the aesthetic temporality of jazz improvisation. It says, later actions within an improvisation change the meaning of former actions. A mistake within an improvisation is something that will have remained a mistake at the end, something that has not been integrated into the unity and meaning of the improvisation. Something is thus not a mistake per se. This is so for the following reason. Not only what and whether something is a mistake, whether something is a mistake is decided in the course of the execution. Rather, the execution, the improvisation, works out what is an element of improvisation in the first place. Whether I repeat a melodic phrase, shift it to another key, modify its rhythm, or develop it afterwards as spelling out the colors of the underlying harmonies makes a difference. And improvisation doesn't consist in piling musical phrases upon each other that are, so to say, mere atoms. Will Evans, I think, got this right. I think it's in the liner notes of Kind of Blue. Jazz is not a prospective art that structures the musical event in advance on the basis of a blueprint, but a retrospective art. I would like to use a phrase from contemporary debates on Hegel and phrase the aesthetic temporality of jazz improvisation in terms of a retroactive holism. And I will spell out what this means a bit more. Retroactive means that the sense of earlier elements is redefined by later elements, that we have a seemingly strange temporal structure compared to what we normally think about the development of time. And holism means that meaning and identity of an individual element can be explained in its manifold relation to the other elements. In a certain sense, the holistic nature of the elements of jazz improvisation is not specific to jazz. To my mind, all works of art are constituted holistically. One has to interpretatively trace the meaning of an element in the context of the other, and putting an element, so to say, in the context of another work of art changes its meaning and identity. Thus, what an element of a work of art means cannot be solely made intelligible by looking beyond the work of art, but one always has to go into the constellation of the work in question. I believe that this description applies even to performance and participatory art, but I cannot say more about that. In another way, one can say each work of art negotiates anew through its singular constellation of elements what those elements are and ultimately what it means to be for this thing to be a work of arts. A work of art. Specific for the improvisation in jazz, however, it's a temporal establishment of the elements, and that this establishment is, so to say, the whole truth here, in contrast to musical interpretations. With the idea of a retroactively renegotiation of the meaning of a totality, one can hint at the fact that this is even commonly the case with regard to the meaning of a certain kind of broader understood action. I could say more about their actions, but I could say more about that, but this is a topic for another talk. If we had broken up with a friend, for example, because he has let us down in a crucial situation, it depends on how we have dealt with it afterwards, whether the friendship is lost for the time being or can be revived. It is true that one cannot undo actions, one cannot go back, but only regret or continue to affirm that one has decided this way or the other. But the meaning of action changes through later action. With Hegel again, we can say the meaning of an action goes beyond what the agent intended with it at the moment of its execution. The meaning of the thing itself shows itself in motion. It shows itself as being that becomes understandable only from the perspective of later actions. Improvisation is an aesthetic, meaningful practice in the sense that it is, so to say, not algorithmic in its structure, even if it proposes manifold habitualist knowledge and skills. If this idea of a retroactive holistic logic of jazz improvisation is convincing, it has the following consequence. Even if fragments of something played earlier appear in a later improvisation, and even if the counterfactual case that an improvisation would be composed solely of fragments that are already found in earlier playings of the improviser, we think about licks here, it is not the case that the improvisation is a mere combination of giving licks, even if it could be part of what the improviser is doing. This is not, so to say, the meaning or the logic of the elements established there. It's not the case that the aesthetic meaning and thus its aesthetic unity is already determined before the course of an improvisation. The idea of a retroactive holistic temporality of jazz improvisation, as opposed to the idea that an improvisation would simply be a composition of material already available in advance, or the following of a path determined in advance, is committed to the idea that an autonomous form of aesthetic success is established in and through the course of improvisation. One can thereby radicalize the structure beyond the singular improvisation in the following sense. Retroactive holism not only characterizes the unity of an improvisation in light of its phases, but also the relationship of improvisations as a whole to each other. This was the meaning when I initially said that playing on standards presuppose previous playings. Improvising presupposes improvising. Jazz is not something that can be made intelligible without a tradition of playing. Just as Wayne Shorter's late improvisations redefine the meaning of his earlier ones, Michael Brecker's improvisations redefine and further define or develop further the meaning of what John Coltrane could have been doing. In Adorno's posthumously published and fragmentary Theory of Musical Reproduction, the following thought is found in this spirit. Even if you would have hated it that I applied on jazz, I have the German quotation here. I will translate it. Whoever does not understand Schönberg today cannot understand Beethoven, but rather obscures his relationship to the work through the reified form of its effect. With this, however, it is asserted that the changes of the work in the interpretations is not a mere matter of merely subjectively explained taste, but are of an objective law-like nature. This thesis is not to be understood as a value judgment, but as a determination of what it means to be part of a practice as the one it is. And to pick up a phrase by Hans-Georg Gadamer, to play jazz is not to do mere anything, but to move to a specific tradition of playing, the question of a dynamic tradition to which one an artistic activity relates itself could be part of what it means to define the artistic activity in question. It's at merely looking at manifest properties. And I think, before I come to the last part, I don't know if you know the controversy Branford Marsalis put on Kamasi Washington some time ago. He, in an interview, said he's not playing jazz at all. And his reason is you can more hear the hip hop roots of his playing than you can hear the jazz roots in the way he's playing the saxophone, even if he's like dressing like Sandra and so on. And this, I just want to show that's not a merely academic question into which tradition of musical practice one is, so to say, has to be seen, but it's a question about getting probably the right way of judging what one is doing. So I now come to some, if I have the time, Lisa, 5 minutes, probably 6 minutes.
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. Also more.
Yeah, just some final thoughts about the relation of interpretation, improvisation. I want to close with some remarks on the relation. To my mind, the retroactive logic just developed applies in a certain way not only to musical performances that are improvisations, but also to musical performances that are musical interpretations of musical works. Nevertheless, I don't want to say by that interpretations are improvisations. In Adorno, you find in the already mentioned book, the idea, I quote, no matter how conscientious a musical performance is, it labored at a moment of the uncommitted tentative, even of improvisation. Adorno is saying, and of course, some of you know Gold and Keaton's idea that every interpretation involves improvisation. That's not my idea. I want to just say that we somehow can learn something about what a work is and what the logic of playing a work means and articulating the meaning of a work if we look at this dynamic of improvisation. From an analysis of the form of success in jazz as a form of success of musical improvisation, something can be learned about the form of success of musical interpretation meant as playing a musical work. Just as the elements of an improvisation and improvisations as a whole stand in a retroactive relationship to each other, so do the interpretations of a work. This is not only because playing a work is never merely a vertical relationship between performer and musical text, but rather always already means being socialized into musical practice that essentially consists of traditions of playing. Rather, it behaves this way also and above all because every musical interpretation must work out the power and sense of the work in question in you. Even if works are not separable from notations, they are not merely in the notation itself. Of course, this is not to be understood in the way that interpreters can do just anything when they interpret a work. It is rather meant to say that interpretations are not already contained in the score. What it means to do aesthetic justice to the work is not already determined before the interpretation. What does it mean that every successful interpretation makes a work to be heard in you? It does not only mean that interpretations always already relate to preceding interpretations. It means above all that an obvious distinction needs to be explained differently than it is most commonly understood. The distinction between properties that are unambiguously defined by a score, such as pitch relations, and those properties, such as phrasing, that are not defined unambiguously by a score. Problematic explanation of this distinction would say that to interpret a work would mean, on the one hand, to fulfill the conditions, and on the other, to shape the aspects that are open, so to say, up for grabs. What is problematic about this idea of splitting the work in two parts is that it suggests that what happens in the context of an interpretation can be divided in this way. In the context of an improvisation of a musical work, it is precisely not the case that some elements of a work would be predetermined in their meaning, while others are up to gusto of the interpreters. In the light of the tempo and micro-timing of a performance, even the harmonic transitions acquire a certain meaning. In the light of phrasing, the melody appears in a new light. Even the non-negotiable conditions of the work are thus not given elements of it in the sense that the meaning would already be fixed beforehand the interpretation. From these remarks, one final thought, it becomes understandable that to what extent the temporal logic of musical improvisation in jazz can also be applied to musical interpretations of musical works. Here, each successful interpretation works out the work in question in a respectively new way in contrast to earlier interpretations. Unlike in the case of improvisation, however, in which the respective musical spatio-temporal event is in a sense already the whole truth, the aesthetic meaning of works is not identical to the individual interpretation of the sum of all or the sum of all interpretations. Nevertheless, works are not independent of the interpretations. They are articulated by them, and their vitality in the sense of their aesthetic relevance is revealed through them. Thank you very much for your attention and interest. So I'll close the presentation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was very interesting. And I think, oh, I see a lot of questions already. So I have also some, but I will leave the floor to the audience. So please don't put your hands down because I don't remember. So please, so I saw Leo, Bia, and Leila.
That was the applause. We were applauding.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So we open the Q&A. So if there are questions, please feel free to raise your hands up. I see. Okay. So maybe I can start, and people may, you know, start thinking about it. So I was, you know, I've heard Alessandro talking about mistakes in improvisation. So this is a topic that I kind of know at least a bit already. And with him, we were discussing about the fact that maybe what is needs to be done is also like distinguishing between different types of mistakes. So we may want to, you know, make a difference between higher types of mistakes, so mistakes that are more complex and involves aesthetic qualities, like you mentioned, and improvisation being boring. Okay, so this kind of failure, and lower mistakes that involves like basic musical elements, like, I don't know, a wrong note, a wrong chord, as in your example. So what do you think about this? Do you think that, you know, your idea, like, I don't know, is able, you know, to incorporate this kind of distinctions between types of mistakes, which I think it's needed in some sense. Not everything,
Yeah.
Unless we define what is a mistake in a very broad sense.
Yeah. No, thank you. I agree. I mean, I took the whole topic. I developed some of this. Of course, I worked together with Alessandro for some time, and we had often had the same sources with regard to, and also taught together a lot. I merely used the question of mistake. How can it be possible that has no clear criteria could succeed and fail? And my idea is to generalize this kind of aesthetic success found in jazz performance to be, if I put it bluntly, to be actually the model of aesthetic success as a whole. If we, at least if we think about art, not in design or other things. That's the basic outlook. And I think a concept I borrow from Hegelian philosophy of history, the idea of retroactivity, and the idea of holism coming from philosophy of language, meaning that we have no pre-given elements, but rather a totality that is strangely in jazz developed, so to say, one step after another. It's not just given. Yeah, this is the basic picture I try to paint. And of course, I think we have to distinguish between different kind of mistake. And I'm not mainly thinking about technical mistakes. That's, you know, this is the kind of beginner idea of jazz improvisation or performance. Like, oh, it's so difficult. Do they hit the right notes? I don't know. Yes, maybe Tommy Flanagan is a different case, but it's also not there a mere technical problem. It's a rather problem of not getting a grip on this kind of new idiom, not new kind of way of improvising. So I'd say the cases that interest me most are rather those higher, you call higher level mistakes. That somehow, I saw a concept by Pat Metheny where he was really destroyed afterwards because he was not okay with his playing in this. Even top musicians, so to say, have this stronger and less strong evenings. And the idea is that is, you can, the more you practice, it doesn't mean that you actually get better at creating this kind of special energy or special aesthetic power of a performance. Of course, you do it. So I'd say rather that there's a gradual difference between top musicians and non-top musicians. So I'd say if I had to decide, first of all, I would say I would like to distinguish, of course, different kinds of mistake, but I'm mainly interested in higher order aesthetic mistakes, being boring, of being repetitive, of sounding like a combination of licks. In some cases, it can be an aesthetic agenda, of course, that it sounds like a combination in terms of if you take a Coltrane lick and play with it and cite it somehow, of course it can be, but normally we all know the performance where it sounds like just a combination of licks somebody has learned, and this is the basic. Those are the basic mistakes I'm interested in, actually.
Do you think that they can also like emerge from the interaction between, you know, people, well, the musicians and the audience, or it's just about how, you know, musicians play? Because, you know, being boring is something that, I mean, you can somehow, maybe you can expect that something is boring, but in some sense you cannot really control being boring, you know. So it's something that it depends on interaction between, you know, the recipient and the producer.
I mean, if this is a bit polemical, but you could form an Aristotelian theory of personal traits. You can say there are boring persons, of course. Maybe, okay, that's a funny remark, but you're right, of course. I mean, I have the idea, but that was not my topic today, that the spelling out this kind of retroactive setting the, in German it's called Voraussetzen der eigenen Voraussetzungen, putting the presuppositions, setting the presuppositions somehow, that's the Hegelian citation, that it is not only this backward-looking dynamic logic, but it's always a collective logic. I would even go so far that solo improvisation could somehow be spelled out as a special mode of collective improvisation, insofar as the solo improviser has to do the things you normally do with your reactions on answering to other musicians. You have to somehow I don't mean it like in your mind, but I mean that you have to generate this kind of dialogical logic in your improvisation that you normally always have when playing with other musicians. And of course, I think it's like, and this was the example of Herbie Hancock, there can happen things, rather really happen, you then have to make sense of, but it's, I'd say that basically to a more or lesser degree, if you think of Oscar Peterson stuff, it's quite dense, already clear what they're doing there. And then if you think about some probably of the later Coltrane recordings, it's really much more unclear somehow in the course what can happen there. But I think, yes, I mean, I would just say there's an inner musical dialogical character, and there is the interaction, of course, with the listeners. And this is an integral part of it's a shared aesthetic temporality, but I'd say jazz is nevertheless somehow conservative on this line if we compare to new developments in new music, which really break in the borders, so to say, between performer and auditorium in this.
Thank you. So are there questions from the audience? If you have some questions, just.
So maybe a little remark. Thank you very much, Daniel. I thought it was a very interesting way to question the roots of the music and the roots of jazz in that case, and the history of the music actually. I have a little question about your retroactive holism, because I didn't get exactly the link between this concept and Hegel. So if you if you are kind enough to make a little point on this. And I was also wondering about that sentence you said that jazz standards are no works, because actually the chart you showed I don't know if you call this a jazz standard, but actually jazz standards, you know, are real works that came usually from Broadway show. For example, you know, I can give you Anything But Love, you know, in a musical show in Broadway, and then what is presented in the real book is not really the jazz standard. If you really want to know the standard, you have to look at the charts of that time and listen to other versions, of course. And my last question is, maybe you know about Jean-Marc Chouvel, because he's been questioning in a very interesting way the link between memory and judgment of the music. And there is a book, what's the name? Analyse musicale. L'analyse musicale. Yeah, it's very simple, the title. But it's really interesting because he's analyzing exactly the way the mind is working. For example, the story of the mistake, you can hear a part of a music, and then depending of the way you recognize or not recognize what's coming next changes your judgment of what happened before. And so I think it was a little bit similar to what you said. That's all. Thank you.
It's interesting. I start the other way around. I end with Hegel. I thank you for I will have to have a look at this book. I haven't read it actually, but thanks for the recommendation. I mean, concerning the question of what a jazz standard is, I would slightly say it, phrase it in a different way. Of course, I know about the roots where they are taken from. I mean, they can be taken from anywhere. A lot of jazz musicians play Blackboard by the Beatles, for example. I have the idea that what is normally being seen as a score is in most cases just a document, a thinned out transcription of recordings. So I would rather say the basic story of jazz is a story of performances being recorded. And then we have something like notations that are helping devices for playing. I mean, I noticed there are a lot of jazz musicians around here probably, but the first thing they told me at the conservatory was burn your real books, throw them away, don't use this stuff. And because I think it's not a practice based on notations. They are a mere auxiliary help for practice. So I think, and this is why I think Wynton Marsalis would say there is a real strong sense one can make do justice to a standard, but I think this is a strong conservative agenda. I think it's wrong because it's difficult to understand what it means to do justice to a standard instead of, which is difficult for itself enough to somehow do justice to a work. So of course you're right, but I'd say standards are reshaping in the ways they are played, and we don't have a first or last authoritative version of them. They are, so to say, embedded in the practice of playing, and they are developed through certain important playings of the standard in question. Now for Hegel, I mean, this
I'm sorry you said that, but I didn't get it, so it was quite fast.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I think I conceive there is no logical basis. You cannot derive what is happening in jazz with a standard from the origins it comes from.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about Hegel.
Ah, yeah. Okay, this was about the second.
Yeah.
And on Hegel, I'm just thinking how to put it. I think Hegel's philosophy, if we take serious the dialectical dimension of it, means that we have a movement of getting better to know what we meant beforehand within a different position. So think of the phenomenology of spirit. He starts with the sinnliche Gewissheit, sensuous consciousness. And we cannot say what this means, what sensuality in human affairs means, if we stay with it and pile another thing like conceptual capacities on that, but rather if we can understand what it means for a human being to have conceptual capacities, we also can now understand what it means to have sensibility. So, and this is not only, I think, this idea of an enrichment, what we need to make clear or understand what to say about the question, what the mind is, to say it most broadly, it's not only a matter of being an enrichment when we end up with a picture of historical social practices that are necessary to think of minded as anyhow. But also we have this direction of the later position gets something right and clear what the former didn't get right and clear through the idea of a distinct negation. It is not that what sensibility is in the former position stays the same in the other shapes of consciousness, but we have a back-looking logic.
Is
the
it,
same, yeah.
Sorry, is it a theological sort of thing?
It's a retrospective teleological thing. That to put it historical, and I mean, Pinkert wrote a good book about it, this Shape of Justice, and also Slavoj Žižek, who is often seen critical, has some good remarks in the Siegel books about that, I think. To put it historically, it is not before the cause clear what is true about us, but it is the way the things develop, what we have to say about it. So the historical shape practically works out or transforms what has been a contingent feature into a necessary feature retrospectively. So this is a kind of, I think, a feature of his dialectical thinking and a feature of the way he conceives of history. And I just wrote a book on human nature and the role of history in that, drawing on Hegel. And I think he's having an alternative between mere contingent models, like think of Foucault or Thomas Kuhn, and teleological Aristotelian outlook, where you have a model like we have this a flower that flourishes, has different already pre-given shapes, but he's doing something else. He's saying what was contingent, non-necessary, becomes a necessary feature retrospectively. And now maybe you get a picture that this kind of development logic, my thinking about jazz music is informed by this, I think, quite attractive development logic, because it undercuts the opposition between mere contingency and teleology.
Okay.
Is this a bit helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Bergson said some things about this, l'armoire au possible is exactly what you said. So that was very dense. Thank you for that communication. Maybe you said you have a script of it. Maybe I'd love to have it, because I don't think I got everything you said, because if you can share the script, that would be very nice, at least for me. No, just one or two remarks. We are a bit late, but yes, on the question of ontology of the work, actually there is a practical move to do, which is to consider that the work is no more the composition, but it's the recording. And so, since you do this move, the question of the origin and the previous material becomes in a way secondary. Sometimes it's overwritten, sometimes it's underwritten, and there can be a standard or not a standard, and all the combinations are possible. And the question of the work is shifted this way. And one advantage that you can consider again that Autumn Leaves is a work, but it's a work of a different kind. And I think we should do this move. Actually, I wrote a book about this, so it would be a bit long to do. And just a second remark about the retroaction and this idea that the main difference between improvisation and scoring music is when you score, you can go back because you can erase what you do and erase the wrong notes and put the right notes instead. And theoretically, you can do that in improvisation, because once a note is played, it's played, and you can't erase it. But actually, the recording changes that a lot. Because when you record an improvisation, you can go back and erase, and in a way that goes on the side of a composition. So it's just a side remark. But
yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I can share the script to all of you if you want it.
Yes, thank you.
I don't have published any version of it, but you can have it. I sent it to you, Lisa, afterwards. Just short answers. I see the first way, of course. My idea is putting a strong connection between a traditionally understood musical work in the tradition of European art music and improvisation jazz. You can do, of course, other things in a way of conceptual engineer the work, the concept of the work in a different way. But what I want to do with it is sparkle a bit of this improvisatory logic into a rigid understanding of the category of work in parts of the debates in philosophy on European art music, if they are Platonic entities and whatever, and so on and so on. Maybe this is a helpful frame to what I'm trying to do there. And I don't say that you cannot go in the other directions. And with regarding to what I basically compare is two kinds of musical events. Improvisations, interpretations. So no recordings. That was not the aim of basic focus of my talk, because then you're right, we have Lenny Tristano, we have Bitches Brew, which is a work by Tio Macero somehow, not only by Miles Davis. But the idea is that if we compare these events that have certain phases, spatio-temporal, bound up to a certain place, that we can say, even if they are formally distinct kinds of musical practice, the logic of interpreting a musical work in the moment has some kind aspects that we normally would say are characteristic for jazz improvisation, not the recordings. I think this would demand more to say on this topic. So maybe also this helps a bit what I was aiming at. So to contrast, to inform somehow a too rigid logic of musical works in the tradition of European art music, and by the logics of jazz improvisation, and to contrast musical improvisations and musical improvisations being two different kinds of events.
So
okay, thank you, Daniel. So it's past 10, so maybe you really have to go. Thank you once again for accepting our invitation. We're glad you could be here with us, and we will see each other again quite soon, in 2 weeks, for the next Séance meeting of our seminar, and we will have Andy Hamilton. Daniel, if you want to come, if you can, you are, of course, welcome.
Thank you so much.
And maybe I just want to add something, because you were speaking about Adorno, and actually there will be 2 meetings in May about Adorno and popular music, and the first one will be in French, but the second one will be in English with Lydia Ger.
Yeah.
Of course, you will be very welcome if you can come. We'll give you the information. Sorry, Lisa.
Of course.
Can I just say one sentence? And the really interesting thing is, the last years I tended always more to an Adornitian way of thinking about works, coming from my book on jazz, which somehow did a performative turn on the work, and now I'm moving. So I'm trying. I'm having a look. Yeah. What I'm now doing is really going into more Adornitian direction when we talk about works. And so I try to come along to see Lydia again. Thanks for the hint.
Thank you very much, and see you all soon. Have a nice evening.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you to everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.